Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our last 15K workshop before semifinal judging. We're going to talk about using data to tell your story, to benchmark, and to communicate your failures and successes in your venture as you look at your market, you look at your investors, and you have sort of keep moving through with your growth mentality. So Theo and I are going to sort of trade back and forth. It can be very conversational. Feel free to ask us questions during the presentation. We'll also be leaving time for some questions at the end, but this is definitely meant to be informative but conversational. So here we go. What have I done? I'm off to a great start. Okay, so we are talking about storytelling through data in your venture. And what are we doing here? You're going to have people who give you a lot of money, ideally, if all goes according to plan, and they're going to want to know what you've been doing with their money. So the best way of telling your story is through a mix of qualitative and quantitative data. It's really common in fundraising, in lots of different things, to give reports to your funders, to your grantors. So keeping a sort of fact-finding mentality as you look at every aspect of your venture is going to be really important in how you communicate, because you want to be honest about what doesn't work. You want to be agile in your responses to those sorts of things, and you want to look at what you've got to continue to grow and iterate. So it's all about telling a really compelling story. Now, I'm trying to keep it pretty broad tonight. Your mileage is going to vary because some of you are in software, some of you are in hardware, some people will be for-profits, some people will be nonprofits. The core concept remains the same. So we'll do some broad strokes. Theo and I will get into some more specifics that diverge, things that are more qualitative, things that are more quantitative. But basically, evaluation is not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. What's good for your venture might not be good for somebody else's. It's about finding that creativity and keeping that sort of storytelling mindset. A for-profit will tell a different story from a nonprofit because the latter is much more mission-driven and service-driven as opposed to bottom-line driven. If you're in a startup, you're going to have so many more things to measure in some ways. And if you're very advanced, you're going to have a track record that, you can look back to as you continue to build and develop. But we're also going to get into something later about your market. Who are you serving? What are the best metrics for your field? They're not all going to overlap neatly. So as we move on, we're going to go through talking through your pitch, through your meetings with people, through your stakeholder conversations. So starting with data in your pitch, take it away, Theo. Theo's muted.
I apologize for staying on mute there. I misclicked. Yeah, so I think just to talk broadly about like what data does or doesn't do. So I think the main thing is, there's a compelling message and a compelling story, and data can't be the entire story, or data is not everything that you want to talk about, but it is really important. And I think it also gives you a lot more memorability and specificity. And so if you think about what sticks in someone's mind when you talk about a specific, like let's say it's $100 billion market, that's different than saying the market's really large. And so talking about there's definitely the problem, but then once you get to kind of the value of solving that problem and being as specific as you can there really helps for someone who's an investor, or in this competition, a judge, someone to really understand kind of what the importance of your solution is. And so that kind of gets at the so what question. I think it helps to give something that you are talking about in order of magnitude, and to talk about the really specific value of what you're trying to do. And then going back to bullet point number 2 for a second. So talk about what's your market question. This is definitely an important one to think about, both for the competition, but then more broadly for your venture, as something that investors will look at or evaluate. Really, like one of the main questions is always going to be TAM, or total addressable market. And so as much as you can, even though you may believe that something is really large, right? Like let's say if you're working on something, healthcare related, people spend lots of money on healthcare. Healthcare is a huge market. That's great. But instead, if you have a very specific number, I'm looking at this specific type of patient with this specific type of disease. There are 40,000 of those people in the United States, and they pay $100,000 a year for treatment. And that's my market. Like that's a much more specific and quantifiable and memorable thing. And so that's kind of the importance there. And then just talking more broadly, this is something that I would definitely look to incorporate into your semifinal presentation if you haven't already. And it doesn't necessarily have to be these exact metrics, but just something to be thinking about. So in terms of there's different kinds of startups and different kinds of metrics that are really important. One thing that's important for everyone is that kind of the break-even point. So at what size do we start to envision becoming profitable? How much are we going to be spending before then? So think about like what's your cash outflows? What's the value of a customer? What does it cost to get that customer? And then kind of like roughly what those ratios are is like how much more are we getting in lifetime value than we're spending to bring someone in the door? And then we won't go through these in particular, but I think especially if you're coming back to look at this as a recording, or we can actually share probably this deck afterwards. But we did notice there were a number of marketplace and hardware related ventures. And so these are just some important data points. And I don't think that like this is not a checklist that you have to complete to have a good application. That's not I guess what I'm trying to say, but more that these are the kinds of things that really make your point and your goals much more specific and much more compelling. Similar to how it's just a little bit more memorable with a quantitative number. I think even an estimated value for these things just shows a level of intentionality and sophistication. So definitely good to have these if you can.
Perfect. So now value feeds right into that. And Theo's going to take this again too. It's more specifics about, conveying all of these really important things. I don't know what I just said. Take it away, Theo.
Yeah, I think the thing I would say, so like one of the first things to think about is product market fit or traction. And so there are different ways to kind of show that your idea has something behind it, right? And so I guess there's different ways to communicate this, but really what you're looking for is the idea that there's just there's like a burning need for this. And so the few ways to kind of go about demonstrating that is talking about, like organic customer discovery. And so people are just looking for your solution and just find you and sign up. So people that you're not advertising to, people who aren't referrals, people who you're not paying to reach, but people who kind of come in and find you. A second thing, that if you already have customers who are either paying customers or pilot customers or are somehow involved, right? This is actually a pretty interesting test that we get advised to use in some of the product management courses over at Sloan. And the question is, how would you feel if you could no longer use whatever the product or service is? And you have to ask customers, and basically, if we were no longer for sale, would you be very disappointed, somewhat disappointed, or would you not really care? And as a general rule, you want about 40% of customers to be saying very disappointed. At around 40%, that's when you know that you've got a pretty strong amount of product market fit. And so that's just another way to gauge. And of course, not everyone will be there immediately, but it's just something to keep in mind. And the underlying point, which is that the customers really want this solution and they'd be sad if we took it away. Like that's an important part to kind of be thinking about or talking about. Then the last point here is on willingness to pay. And so this is an interesting thing, and it's a little bit hard to test, especially if you are looking at something that you don't necessarily have a product yet, or you don't necessarily have paying customers yet. And so you can't say, this is the specific price point that I think we should charge, or this is the specific amount of value that I think a customer would receive. But there is there are definitely, as always, creative solutions here. And so if you think about this, think about what your solution is. how are people paying today, right? And it could be something that people are paying directly for it. They could be, spending money on something like art supplies through Amazon, or they could be paying with their time. And so it could be something like a customer is going and spending a lot of time on, Blick.com or somewhere else, looking at all of these different art supplies, and how much time are they spending? How much extra effort and energy are they spending? And so think about that time, and then you can think about how does that customer value their time. And so, like, let's say if it's someone who's, really busy, has a lot of disposable income, but like works constantly, they may value their time really highly. And so, in a way that you can kind of quantify, okay, someone who makes $50 an hour is spending 8 hours a week doing this thing. Now I can kind of quantify that's what they're paying today. And typically, you can think about this as a loose metric or a loose idea, but whatever value you're saving for your customer, either in terms of cost or time, you can usually capture about 1/10 of that. And so in that example of someone who's making $50 an hour, 8 hours a week, I think I said, so that is what, $400 a week. So reasonably, like if you can deliver something to them for $40, that saves them that time, they'll want to do it. And so that's just a kind of a loose way to kind of get at willingness to pay and value and things like that. But more than anything else, I think the takeaway here is try to quantify this the best you can. And even if it's not perfect, even if it's not scientific or statistically significant or anything like that, I think, again, just kind of the fact that you're doing that kind of validation and doing that kind of work and really know your customers well enough to have that kind of detailed insight into your problem and solution is really what's valuable about this.
All right. So, assessing the status quo. You've all got a startup sort of venture. You're at various different places. And the really elemental thing, after communicating all of these really cool data points in your pitch, now you've got to look at your venture and what have you got going for you? You kind of have to start like a laundry list. It can be holistic, it can be specific, but look, how many full-time equivalent employees do you have? Who are you employing? How can you pay them? Are you paying them in kind? Is this a sweat equity kind of thing? Do you have budget? What kinds of in-kind assets do you have? A performing ensemble might not have an awful lot going for it, but if you've got a core roster and you're paying people and you've got access to a performance or a recording space, that's something you've got going for you. Or if you're beta testing something, you've got, durable goods and you've got prototypes, you've got, you can start building testimonials, you can have your aspirations, you can have a loyal customer base. Before you even get to finances, there are so many things that are very storytelling and data rich that you can look at if you just sort of take inventory of everything you've got going for you. So it boils down to what are people going to want to listen to? How will this be memorable? How will this be something that you can convey to people that show that you're on a positive trajectory and get them interested in you? Theo.
Yes. And the next part is about kind of the forward-looking piece. And so thinking about how you think your business will grow. And so I think there are, it's tempting always to really look at like companies that are, you consider like a rocket ship where they really took off and grew really rapidly, and try to basically like apply those same numbers or try to assume that your venture will grow exponentially really quickly. And I think while that's obviously you want to be ambitious and have an optimistic outlook, at the same time, I think there are important things to think about, and especially once you start to bring on either co-founders or employees or investors, they'll kind of rely on you to be, the voice of reasonable growth here. And so you think about, first thing I'll talk about is like what's kind of my pipeline. And so if you think about you want to grow in the next month, you want to take on 3 or 4 new customers, that actually probably means that you need to be talking to a group of maybe 10 or maybe 20 potential leads. And so if you think about, it's important to kind of understand that relationship and also think about what am I projecting or saying is going to happen. And if you don't kind of have a clear idea of like what your pipeline looks like, then you maybe don't want to estimate or kind of plan or build for this huge amount of growth without kind of an idea where it's coming from. And realistically, like there's a kind of a saying in at least like sales, and it is definitely true, I think, entrepreneurial sales as well. Whatever you think your pipeline is, you should cut it in half and then cut that in half. And so reasonably, like it's probably about 1/4 of what you think is going to happen will actually come through, because stuff just doesn't work out for different reasons. An important thing also to be thinking about is what changes as you grow. And so if you think about the amount of time and effort that you're spending on things, that as that scales up, what will happen? 1 second. I think if my headphones die, I'll try to just keep talking. Let me know if my voice or audio sounds very weird. Yeah, and so like as you grow, as you scale up, your time as like a founder or founding team is very limited. What will have to change? Do you bring on more people? Do you start to find ways to try to save time or save costs or save energy? And it's important to think about that. And then the last thing I'll say that is, I think, very underestimated or undervalued is that like as you grow and acquire, bring on more customers, you actually for a while have negative value, right? And so when you bring on a new customer, there's a time when you provide a service or you provide something to them, but you haven't yet gotten your money back. So as an example, let's say I sign up for Twitter, I have to create an account. There's cost associated with hosting my content and doing all that kind of stuff. But until I see like a certain number of ads, I'm still a negative financial value for them, right? Until I reach a certain point, I am still in the red. They've paid for me to be on the platform, but I'm not yet breaking even. And so if you do this same kind of calculation and you think about now, okay, we got 100 customers, 1,000 customers, 10,000, and you think about like you want to grow really rapidly, you have the same effect, the same kind of green area where it's negative times 10,000, right? This is a hugely compounding effect. And so just something to think about when you're projecting growth is how much of this kind of negative, how much of this churn or spend can we afford before we start to break even on customers? And when will we run out of money? Because we need to kind of keep those things balanced.
Excuse me. So check your plan. There is a lot to be said. Theo was just talking about being able to project, being able to look at that, and it can feel like it's all happening kind of in a vacuum. So, Theo, what are your recommendations for this?
Yeah, I would say that like where you can look at comparable businesses, and then especially I think if you have, sorry for the background noise here, by the way. So if you have a comparable startup, the best thing that you can do is find startup mentors, find people who are in relevant spaces, talk to people who have been on a similar entrepreneurial journey and have been at the different stages that you're probably going to be at. And so depending on like what your venture is, it doesn't have to be exactly the same, but I think if you are looking at something that's like consumer facing B2C software, look for entrepreneurs or mentors in that space, and they can help you with where they kind of what their numbers, what their costs, things like that look like. And if you are something like an apparel company, you should look for other apparel companies and try to find those other mentors, other people who have been in that spot before. Now, that's not always possible to do. It's not always easy to do. People aren't always super forthcoming with their own data and information as well. And also that takes time, right? So you have to go out and develop those relationships, find those people. A fast and easy shortcut in some ways, but also it's not quite as good quality, is looking at different sources of publicly available information. So as an example, we have Nike here, and their gross margins are typically around 47 or 48%. And so I know that if I'm starting a shoe or shoe related company, reasonably, like that's probably the best I could do in the short term, right? I don't have the same production scale as Nike. I don't have the same brand as Nike. I don't have any of those same things. And so if I have like that metric is probably even better than I could hope for, but at least I kind of know I'm not planning on, 80 or 90%. And if you say, well, maybe I sell fancy shoes, maybe I have more of a luxury footwear or brand. These Nikes here, I just picked as an example because they're like $5,000 or $10,000. Like these are super expensive, super fancy ones. I know Shannon Rose, I saw that reaction. They're called the Yellow Lobster Nikes. I don't really know. I mean, I guess I can kind of see it when you look at them. But yeah, so like even then, right? Even if you're luxury or you're fancy apparel, in some ways, so are they. And so just try to find something relevant and publicly available, and that can at least help guide you. And that's kind of a short answer.
And then I advanced the slide. Perfect timing. Love when that works. So in addition to looking at, comparable organizations for business plans, you also want to hit this market and you want people to trust you. You want people to pick you. And testimonials are really helpful. Qualitative data, I think people get really caught up in hard numbers. They tell a story themselves, but there are certain intangible things that make us all really excited about our favorite brand of footwear, favorite brand of like ketchup, even. Some of this is because of very qualitative, intangible values. So if you can get information from your users and from your own venture, survey people, look at social media, look at testimonials, because I've sort of semi-coined quantitate-ish, because you can take things like number of 5-star reviews, and that's some hard numbers, averages, things like that. But it's all really important. We all read the reviews. I do anyway. I read Consumer Reports. If I'm trying to buy a new microplane zester, I'm still going to go and look and see what people have to say about it. So getting rave reviews, getting good qualitative support underpins a really good storytelling narrative that you can employ when you're pitching, or when you're talking with potential customers, or when you're talking with your funders, your investors. So I've got some examples of how to build your story. This one's interesting. It will be happier, I promise. But, there was a situation a couple of years ago where 34 miniature horses were in quite poor health and they needed to be rehomed. So the MSPCA, local animal rights organizations, banded together. So somebody who works here said that it was one of the saddest rescues they had experienced in quite a while. There were so many animals, they were in such desperate condition. Now, this is a really good hook. It's a dreadful story, but we want to see how it turns out. So, we've had our Discord, but fortunately, we have a solution. The Animal Rescue League arrived in time to remove the horses from these deplorable conditions and begin the treatment that they'll need as we ready them for their new lives. Okay, we know that this is going to end well for the horses, but what happens? How do we communicate the particulars of this situation? So if you look at it, we have data. We have the number of horses and their destinations. If we were reporting to somebody about what happened, we would have to say 18 of them went to Nevins, 16 went to the Animal Rescue League. If we want to tell a story about our budget, we talk about how it cost about $1,000 per horse for the ongoing treatments that they needed. That was food, shelter, deworming from parasites, things like that. You can measure their improvement. Are they healthier? Are they gaining weight? Are they happier? Are they eating more? Are they dewormed? Like, some of these are quant, some of these are qual. You want to keep this story fresh. You want to keep the public apprised of the adoption statuses, and there are numbers in that. So really just pick apart every level of the story and what you can communicate as something that was a tangible and actionable item. And this story, I mean, nobody likes hearing about, malnourished animals, but what they did to handle this situation will also help to build a scaffold and inform how they'll respond to similar situations in the future. So if you know how you can rehabilitate them, how much it costs, where they can go, quantify how many of these animals that you saved, people are going to start trusting you. You're going to have a good reputation. So, there are Google reviews. They save pigs, they save a lot of other kinds of animals, and people are saying it's the most wonderful animal shelter you could ever go to, or the best experience I've ever had. I would recommend to all. So, if you sort of jumble up the quant and the qual elements of this, you've got a very mission driven organization, the MSPCA. They have fulfilled their mission and they've told a story. We had 34 horses who came to us in pretty bad shape. And, you identify each of the storytelling elements that make it really compelling. You figure out where the communicable outcomes are, and then you build loyalty. I mean, if I ever had to adopt a pet, I'd probably go to Nevins Farms MSPCA. Like, these testimonials matter, and their fulfillment of their mission and their communication of their success are all really sound structural underpinnings to be able to demonstrate success. So, further expressing outcomes, look at past documentation, look at your prior benchmarks. What did you say that you were going to do? Did you do it? How did you do it? Did you exceed your goals? That's great. If you didn't, why not? And what else is compelling? Basically, how can these outcomes build a platform for your continued growth and benchmarking? Because we can't rest on our laurels. You've always got to be sort of building and iterating and looking at the next opportunities. So, looking at sort of a logic model kind of approach, you look at your inputs, you look at all the steps you need to take, you look at your outputs, and then your outcomes. And that will sort of keep you honest. It'll keep you telling your story. It will keep you able to build and iterate and grow and develop. So, this also leads to really cold analysis of how you communicate using data, your successes and your failures. You got to keep your butt covered, and you have to be willing to own your shortcomings. Make contingency plans for things. Make sure that you aren't shooting for the moon. You don't want to say that you're going to make $1 billion in your first year. Be a little conservative in your growth, and also be really self aware and analytical in a way that will help you to preserve a growth mentality, because it's not always going to be easy. It's not always going to be fun, and you're not going to do everything right. But that's okay. That's how you learn. But that's also not a sexy way to approach an investor or your market. So, keep your growth mentality and keep your swagger. Diagnose what happened. Why is it happening? What does it mean moving forward? It's really common, as we noted, for early companies to underperform, or they might overperform really wildly versus what they set out and said that they would do. But, the upshot here is that you've got to set a new best possible plan using all of the information that you now have at your disposal. I mean, any measurable outcome, any data, good to have, will help you with your road mapping for the future. So I've got an example. We were talking about some more numbers driven things earlier. This is going to be about how you communicate when things don't go exactly according to plan. The Handel and Haydn Society is a period instrument orchestra. It's the oldest continually operating arts nonprofit in the United States. And they have a really robust education and community engagement program as part of their mission, not just to perform really good concerts, but also to give back to the community, get more people interested in the arts. So they have these public school programs. They go into underprivileged public schools that don't have music teachers and are not getting the required, recommended, or suggested amounts of arts education per the Massachusetts state frameworks curriculum. So they go and bring resources to underperforming schools that don't have the necessary faculty to cover these areas. And they really wanted to make sure that they were not just catering to, affluent, primarily white Caucasian markets here. So they're going in and they wanted to expand the number of BIPOC students that they served. They didn't meet this benchmark. There was some funding that didn't come through. There was a school partnership that fell through because of a transition with a principal. There were certain things that weren't really in the cards, but there were other ways that they could tell their story. They could sort of flip the narrative, because what ended up happening is that without being able to expand the number of students that were served, they were able to funnel their resources more in a more concentrated way to their existing partnerships. So rather than expanding, they were able to deepen their impact. They were able to give 3 hours per week of education instead of 1 or 2. They were able to hit more students within individual schools instead of expanding the number of schools. So at the end of the day, they didn't meet this particular benchmark, but the way that they communicated their success was basically discussing how much more in depth they were able to um, teach, engage, instill appreciation in, and meet curricular benchmarks with a more concentrated group. So always figure out what you can talk about. It's not misleading if you screw up, if you miss a goal, but something else goes really well, then like cling to that. Make sure that you know how not to replicate the mistake that you made, but keep telling the good story. So sort of takeaways before we move into some questions: measure everything. Look at what you've got, like you're trying to sell it to people. Look at your assets, look at your opportunities, and measure things that don't even seem like they will be statistically significant, because you never know how things will interact. Just find new ways of gauging everything, because everything is good. You want to build your story as robustly as possible and then trim it down. You don't want to be left scrambling trying to fluff things up like you're writing a paper an hour before it's due. Look at how you can accomplish your goals in a way that will be immediately and intuitively communicable to somebody on the outside. That could be a consumer, that could be a funder. But having infographics, having easy ways of communicating things, having a really great story, having an amazing testimonial or review. You can know how well you're doing sort of backstage, back ops, but you need everybody to be able to know quickly in a digestible way why you rock and why this venture is thriving. So there will be moments when it's less thriving. So when your plans change and when you are thrown a curveball, keep being agile, be really creative, and be responsive to opportunities for clever problem solving. H&H didn't get their benchmark, but they were able to offer something else instead as an indicator of the efficacy of their programming. And when you're setting goals, make sure that you're sort of keeping a mind toward storytelling, toward data expression, because this will facilitate other outcomes that you can emphasize again if things don't go according to plan. And just keep telling an awesome story is sort of my upshot. Theo, do you have any other things in closing to add?
No, I think we can probably go on to Q&A, and then one last thing I'll say on this point is that there's definitely lots of positive and negative examples. Just one thing that's really top of mind for me, actually, with some of the work that I've been doing with it's actually a group of investors, and it's a venture capital firm. One of their companies, they were looking at raising more money. They barely missed. They had a projection of revenue for Q1 of 2021 that they barely missed. And actually, I don't think it was so much the miss, but they just didn't have a good explanation, or they didn't have a good story. And they weren't exactly sure why it happened. So they kind of came up with well, maybe it was this, maybe it's that, we're not super sure. And that actually caused the investor to delay. And so right now they're actually looking at, how do we get more funding? What do we do now? And so obviously, I think that's a negative example, and there's obviously positive examples as well. But that's something to think about, is just kind of again, it's not so much, the data itself always definitely matters. And at a place like MIT, I think we have to all, agree to that. But is more kind of like the story and understanding the relationships between the data and your business and kind of like the root causes behind some of these things. And so that's I think what's most important and definitely the key takeaway from tonight.
That was really well put. And I think that's, it can feel intangible. And I know that we weren't able to get as specific with all of you about your ventures in particular, but I hope that this was a helpful sort of broad overview and narrative because, like Theo said, you got to be able to back it up. Otherwise, the money might go away. And you want everybody to recognize you as successful, to want to be on board, buying your product, engaging in your services, funding you to do it. So yeah, just always be ready, always be thinking about growth, and always think about how you can measure all of this. And with that, I'm going to stop my screen share and see if anybody has any questions or conversation points. We're also available via email in case anything comes up that you are not thinking of right now, or would rather, if you've got some place to be, you can always hit us up.
Yeah, exactly. As you're working through your applications, do you have any things where you feel like there should be a data point here, but I'm not sure how to get there or how to address it? We'd be happy to try to also help you work through something like that. So definitely feel free to reach out.
Absolutely. If there are no questions.
Time.
Oh, good.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Awesome presentation, first of all. Thank you.
Thanks.
Highly informative. One question I have is, I guess, the uncertainty. And a lot of numbers and data, there's like a sense of like, especially as an engineer, with engineering background, like uncertainty is very important when you're doing something physical. So when you're doing projection, etc., how much emphasis should you put on like the uncertainty of your calculation or measurement?
I think that there is a sort of sweet spot where you have to stay confident so people trust you, but you have to stay receptive to the idea that it's not going to work. And I think being ambitious, finding the line of ambition with conservatism it's a sort of difficult concept to pinpoint because you don't want to lowball yourself and you don't want to suggest that you're not going to grow. But again, you can't just go screaming out of the gates saying we're going to make $1 billion next year. So I think that having composure and confidence in what you know that you can deliver with that sort of measure of humility. I would also say not to be shy about the uncertainty. I think that if you manage people's expectations up front and say, here's how our choices were informed, this is how we're going to go on from there. I think people are comfortable having those conversations. Like Theo just said, if you don't have an explanation for why things worked or why things didn't work, you're not going to get consumer confidence and you're not going to be able to build or grow. If you're just flinging things at the wall to see what sticks, then, I guess don't be uncertain. Silly advice, but there will be things that go well. There will be things that don't go well. So, I think that if you've got a robust infrastructure that is data driven and outcome driven, then you'll have a really good idea. And as you continue to develop, your confidence in that will work. And more to that point, there are plenty of places that got completely comprehensively hosed by COVID. Something might come out of the woodwork that is completely unexpected. And in that case, having contingency plans and being able to still talk about how you succeeded is, an important thing. Were you still able to compensate your employees? Did you keep people working during the pandemic? Were you able to shift to some other form of content consumption? Like, there will be uncertainty, but always be ready kind of to talk about how awesome you are. Okay, life just threw me this curveball. Everything is a disaster. Look at how we're flipping this to our advantage. Just create opportunities wherever you can. And that will help to mitigate some of the uncertainty. If you've got that sort of exploratory minded perspective about it, then if you go off script a little bit, it's like very forgivable.
Thank you.
Cool. Anything to add, Theo? Anybody else? It can be a conversation too. If anybody has questions or input, this is the democratic part.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask, how is it in like the arts community? Would you say it's similar to like startup culture in a way that they also have this like very scrappy kind of like failure is what we want culture, or is it more like a bit more conscious about how they're doing things, a bit more conventional? How like how's the art community going over what you're addressing?
It's really interesting because in some ways, like an under-resourced arts nonprofit never leaves scrappy startup mentality phase, but that is really all about outcomes, because if you're working on a shoestring budget, you've got to convey how you're delivering, because in that kind of situation, some of your revenue will be from program services. If you're in a performing arts nonprofit, you will sell a certain number of tickets, but the majority of your income is coming at the whim of others. That could be whether or not you were successful soliciting major donations or an annual appeal campaign. You're kind of shaking the couch for loose change in some cases, because every $10,000 donor and every $10 donor, they all matter. You could be writing grants, you could be, basically you've got to be able to talk about and substantiate your awesomeness, because your existence is at the whim of people deciding to support you and part with their money. So if anything, as challenging as the arts can be as a field, they have to be like wizards of expressing outcomes. I learned an awful lot about data collection when I worked as a grant writer for some arts nonprofits, because those are serious financial institutions and foundations that are parting with their resources, and they want to know how that money is being spent. So you've got to know there were 83 children in the youth chorus, or at this concert at Symphony Hall, it was a sellout, and that means X number of thousands of people. You've really got to be pretty mechanical about talking about something that is largely so difficult and intangible to measure, because that's what keeps people opening their wallets. So I think that as challenging as it is to project growth and to facilitate growth in a lean nonprofit mentality, as far as storytelling and data and expressing outcomes are concerned, that scrappy mentality really serves that sector very well, because like it or not, you're continuing to justify your existence on a daily basis. So if you have that mentality, maybe under a little bit less duress, that's a really good way to move forward. Just, assert your awesomeness and consider that you're basically justifying your existence and backing it up with these really awesome outcomes.
Yeah, I think that's very well said, and also something that we're seeing at Trendify. Like we've got all of those crazy ideas like popping up in our minds all day long, things that we potentially could do. But then what we're seeing is whenever we are talking to our stakeholders, or like people like you, we cannot go out there and be like, oh, like just today we had this awesome crazy idea that we want to try. Like this is not how it works. We must kind of stick to our narrative,
Yep.
right? And make and justify the whole thing. Exactly what you're saying.
And that
right?
can be hard, right? Because if you've also got all of these aspirations, you want to make sure that you are communicating everything that you're doing effectively, and you want to make sure that you're going to be able to accomplish these things. So having that storytelling mentality is great, and having a place to go. If you've got an ambition and a trajectory, that's great, but like conversationally presenting some of these really creative ideas before you have any outcomes to back them is what's going to turn a potential supporter off. They don't want to know what these really cool ideas are until you can prove that you're going to make them happen and that it's worth their time and money.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I would say for us, like this one idea that we have, kind of like snap it, get it. I mean, that's what we are about. That's what we are bidding. Like that is already enough to like get them excited,
Yeah.
and get them going. And we really learned, like exactly what you're saying, that like focusing is really much more about not being distracted about things that do not really matter, rather than trying out everything we can get our hands on and doing a mediocre job on all of those things. You know, rather specialize on one and get that going. Hard enough already. It's
Yeah, I think
not yet
that's
working
that's
as
a
well
good
as it could.
takeaway, because it's hard to see sort of the forest for the trees too when you are
Oh
so
yeah.
close to this and when you are so committed to it. A lot of this sort of intrinsically makes sense to you. You're always thinking about how you want to succeed, but that internal ambition also needs to be externalized in ways that make a lot of sense to people who are less familiar with this. And you know, it's awesome to have 10 really great ideas in your own personal pipeline, but until you know how to communicate how effective they're going to be, like, they're not ready for prime time.
Yeah, very much feeling that. Yeah.
And it's cool though, because the more data you can gather, the more success that you can demonstrate, then you get to start ramping up to these ambitions. And you say, based on our past history of this,
Yeah.
this new thing, this new idea, this new feature is, you know, likely to succeed. Come on and help us. Like, it it leaves a lot of room. So, you know, if you're doing a good job with your benchmarking and with your data collection and proving yourself, then people will also be excited. You know, once you establish that track record, you know, and you're not susceptible to crazy anomalies, you know, you'll know what people like, you'll know what people want, and then you can use that to inform how you continue to build toward those other dreams.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that is very, very well said. I mean, we're seeing that like every day, reaching out to, you know, major fashion brands. Like the number one reason for them rejecting us is literally like, okay, so what we are seeing is you're kind of ambitious kids at MIT. You're building something that could potentially be great, but what's your track record, right? Like
Yep.
you've never done something like that before. You know, what's like, how can we be reassured that it's actually going to create us returns, right? And yeah, I think also this competition is a great way to build a track record in a sense, connect with people, kind of really practice getting your narrative out there.
Mm-hmm.
Because it can be huge disalignments. Is also what we've been seeing, right? And just being out there and talking to people, just like you, just like the other participants, was a great experience, and it's much undervalued, um, much underappreciated when it comes to building your own thing, I think.
Well, that just made my night. I mean, we're really happy to be here, and we're hopeful
Yeah.
that this will help people's track records, just being able to convey some of these things. You know, in the fundraising world, they say that gifts beget gifts, grants beget grants. Your project will become more attractive to people when they see that others have taken the risk or decided to invest or feel that the outcome is probable enough that they want to be part of it. So, you know, being able to demonstrate those things should poise you pretty well moving forward. I mean, it's, I think, something that is a little neglected in these conversations. So I'm really glad that we've sort of got that value added in how we've structured this competition. But I think that, you know, whether you get to the finals, whether you win or not, ideally, having been through this competition, you know, even making it into the semifinal round is part of a track record that might help somebody. Like, if the buck stops here, and I don't know what's going to happen with the judging, you've been doing a really amazing job and you've been great. I can't speak as to what possible outcomes will happen, but if you can list participation in this, then another accelerator might be interested. People will see that you have a track record of taking this seriously. That's data, that is storytelling, that goes on a resume or an application to something else. You were a member of this competition. It shows that you are committed to, you know, raising funds, raising awareness, but also going through a sort of incubation process. You know more now than you did when you walked in, and that just puts you already by default in a better position for whatever the next opportunity or competition or funder conversation is.
Yeah, 100%, 100%.
Yeah, it's exciting. I mean, that's the thing. Even, if you win it, that's amazing. Accolades, great. But if you don't, you've still done something tangible that you can now express as an outcome. So, just get into that storytelling mentality and count everything, because everything turns into data.
One thing I'll say too, just as a quick thought for your particular case, if you're looking at trying to reach out to these major fashion brands, I think one thing that is really helpful is leaning on the credibility of somebody who has been in the space. And so if you think about either I talked about trying to find maybe a mentor or someone who's done something really similar, and trying to get both their data, but also that person can be a really valuable way to introduce you to people in the industry, right? And you kind of get to borrow their credibility. Mm-hmm. The other thing that in your specific case, I think you kind of think about an order of operations where you go and scale the end users, and then that would help you get in the door with investors, and then those investors can help make some of those introductions, and also just having names of even medium to well-known investors is a huge door opener as well. So just something to think about, and I'm sure you're thinking about this stuff, but just kind of that progression, I think, is something that's kind of hard to gauge at times.
Yeah, actually we are already executing on exactly that. We've been trying out a couple of things, to build a track record and kind of hack our way through the system, right? And one thing we've been doing is exactly what you're saying. We reached out to someone in LA that is running his own custom suit kind of boutique, this guy doesn't really know too much about AI or the fashion tech space, but he has the connections, right? He's connected to Balenciaga, even Gucci, Chanel, all of those, right? Mm-hmm. I was like, oh wait, actually what you're building, I love that. I really do love that and support that. Here's the contacts, was as easy as that.
That's amazing. And networking is another huge key. I mean, you build your network, it all starts to fall into place. Data storytelling, good pitch, good product, solid value proposition, right networking. These are sort of the steps that build to the resources, really. So,
yeah. Oh, cool. Yeah, really exciting times. We're looking forward to the semifinals and finals, hopefully, at some point. And yeah, fingers crossed.
Yeah, I'm excited to see how everybody conveys the growth that their ventures have undertaken in the last few months, how everybody integrates and applies some of the feedback from that initial feedback round. I mean, I'm getting really excited. So, tell your story, and I can't wait to read it.
You have reason to be. Exciting times ahead.
I like it. I like that attitude. Very good.
Okay.
Cool. Well, if you have any other questions, let us know either now or drop us emails. And I'll be looking forward to your submission.
Cool. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's everything from my side. Wish you guys a great evening, and hopefully talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks, Max. Have a great night.
Have a great night. Bye.